All right, let's pray before we get started. Anyone to pray for? Yeah, pray for the youth. They're leaving 8 a.m. Oh, congrats. That's great. Everything go okay with the birth? Good. You said you got 2 more coming this year, is that right? Okay. Yeah. All right, well, let's pray. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you that we can be here in spite of the weather. And Lord, I thank you for all that you've done in the history of the church. As we conclude our time looking at it tonight, I pray that you will help us understand how we got to where we are today as we work our way up to now. And God, I pray that you would be with us as we go from here tonight and help us to continue the story of the church and the story of Christ in our lifetime and on into our descendants. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are on week 12. I think, was it May 3rd last time we met? So tonight we finish out. We have arrived at the end of the story, or at least the most present part of the story. The story won't be over until Jesus returns, so church history is going to continue happening until Jesus returns one day. But this story, I've called it the story of us. This study's been called the story of us because this is our spiritual family lineage. This is how we got here. I have done a lot of work on my own family tree, and as I do that, I map out all these people, and I always think to myself, these aren't just names and birth dates and death dates. Each of these people lived a life just like I did for, several decades, and they had a story, and they had a life, and all of the events of their life were arranged to bring me about. If all of their lives hadn't played out exactly the way they had, I wouldn't be here. And the same is true for all of us. And the same is true with the church. Everything that's happened over the last 2,000 years, the way it's happened has led to us being here now. God has used every one of the people of church history to bring us into existence. And I'm calling tonight History in the Making. I've been using a curriculum for our study in church history up until now, but the curriculum I was looking at stopped at 1929, so I had to write this one from scratch. And so this one is called History in the Making because this is the history we're living in right now. If the Lord tarries 500 years from now, our descendants will be in a church history class at their local church, and they'll be studying the time that we live in right now. God is working over the course of history to accomplish His great will, so tonight we look at that. I want to look back and reflect on the history of the church since 1900, specifically in the U.S., since that's our story. A lot of these things, as I work through it, I'm going to fly through because there's just no way to cover it all in detail in one night. Very high overview of a lot of this stuff. Most every era we're going to look at I'm going to share some good things about what happened during that time. I'm also going to share some critiques of what happened in that time. So I want to be fair and balanced with each of these time periods. And what I hope you'll notice is that this is your first line there in the middle. The last 100 years of Christianity here are not just a continual decline. That's how it's often talked about, since the 50s, it's just been going downhill and we're about to run the truck off into the ditch. But it hasn't been a continual decline. It's been more of an ebb and flow in the last 100 years. A wave of influence. I've made this chart for you at the top here. This is kind of the timeline we're working from tonight. This is the timeline of American history as well as how the influence of the church over the past 100 years. And what I hope you notice is it's been an ebb and flow. There's been high points and there's been low points. And there's been things that have led us out of the low points back into a high point and things that have brought us down to a low point, and we've had to turn around and do some things differently. And so we'll work our way through this. So we start, if you remember when we met on May 3rd, we talked about the clash between liberal and conservative theology. that Orthodox Christianity, conservative Christianity had been going forth, but there started to be the Enlightenment thought. There started to be things coming over from Europe, different ideas of philosophy, and it started to dilute Orthodox faith, and people were adopting liberal theology. That clash happened. Tensions were there, but it wasn't yet really what we would call a war until the 1900s. And the conflict of it went public in 1920s. So we're now, your first line there, we're in the aftermath of the clash between liberals and conservatives. It went public in 1925 in a situation that happened in Dayton, Tennessee. There was a law in Tennessee called the Butler Act, which banned the teaching of evolution in public schools. And out of that law came a trial called the Scopes Monkey Trial. It's just called the Scopes Trial, but they've nicknamed it the Scopes Monkey Trial. John Scopes was a substitute teacher, and he was accused of illegally teaching evolution in school. He wasn't a regular biology teacher. He was substituting for a class one day, and he briefly reviewed the material with the class that was in the textbook, and it included evolution. Honestly, later he was questioned about it, and he said, I didn't even realize I taught evolution, honestly, but that's what happened. He was found guilty of breaking the Butler Act, and he was fined $100, which would have been a lot of money in 1925, I'm guessing. But he was accused of that, and it was taken to court. It was Tennessee versus Scopes was the trial. William Jennings Bryan represented Tennessee. He argued in his case that communities had the right to decide what schools taught. On the other side, defending Scopes, Clarence Darrow was an agnostic lawyer, and he represented Scopes. And he was a part of the ACLU, and he used this opportunity to push an agenda. The case was less about one teacher and more about staging a constitutional test case over religion, education, and science. Scopes was found guilty, fined $100, though later his conviction was technically overturned. The trial was used by the media to portray conservative Christians as backwards and anti-science. We're not anti-science. Science belongs to the Lord. He governs all biology, all chemistry, all cosmology, and every other field. Christians do differ on the issue of evolution. As you may know, there are young earth Christians and old earth Christians. Young earth Christians are those that believe that the Genesis chapter 1, the 6 days of creation are literal days, and that the earth is only about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Old earth Christians are those who believe God created the universe, but they believe that he used the evolutionary process over millions of years to do it. I am a young earth Christian. I just read Genesis 1, and it seems to me there's a morning and an evening to each of these days. It seems like it's a literal day. And when I say that, the biggest thing that people bring up is, why does the earth look old then? When scientists study the fossil record and all of that, why does it look like this is millions of years old? Well, what I would answer to that is, how old was Adam when he was made? The day Adam took his first breath, how old was he? Well, he was a day old. How old did he look physically? We don't know, but he's at least a full-grown man at the time. So God created Adam new, looking old. And so it's not that far of a stretch to me to think that God created the universe new, looking old. Also, as we know, science changes all the time. So I certainly line up with science, but there's always the possibility that science is going to change 5 years from now and reinterpret everything. So the Scopes Monkey Trial marked a turning point when Christians began to see a loss of influence in American culture. Just to flash forward a little bit, in 1968, the Supreme Court ruled in Epperson versus Arkansas that a state cannot ban teaching evolution. So we went in 40 years from evolution being forbidden in Tennessee to being taught to, in the 60s, it being forbidden to prevent evolution from being taught. Unfortunately, this incident began something that I think was negative. It didn't immediately happen, but this sparked what would happen over the next few decades of Christians pulling out of cultural institutions. Because of all this happening, Christians began to pull away from cultural institutions and make their own, form their own institutions. So you had Christian schools start to be formed, Christian radio stations, Christian film studios, all of those things. And those things have done good for a lot of things. Like, we've seen a lot of good come out of those things. But we must recognize that pulling ourselves out of the culture and siloing ourselves off is the opposite of the Great Commission. We don't silo ourselves off from the culture. We remain in the world, but we don't be of the world. In the midst of all of this, in case you didn't catch it in your notes there, this guy in the middle, that's John Scopes with the hat on. Christians began to see a loss of influence in the culture as the first line, and this resulted in Christians pulling out of the culture as the second line. Third line is that in the 1930s and 40s, as you had Christians pulling out of the culture, you had another group of Christians that became known as neo-evangelicalism. That they saw a ton of fundamentalists pulling out of the culture, and they pushed back against that and said, no, we're going to engage the culture. We're not going to run away from the culture. We're going to bear witness to the culture. We're going to be within the culture. Now, decades later, that had a negative effect. It was good when that was being done, but obviously, decades later, it led to something like the seeker-sensitive movement, if you know what that is. It's this movement that came about in the 80s, I think, where essentially you cater church to the unbeliever. You make church on Sunday morning all about unbelievers, so you do whatever means necessary to get them in the door and to oftentimes entertain them in the hopes of reaching them. Someone that follows the seeker-sensitive model today is Andy Stanley. So that's why I think we said a few weeks ago that he has had a conference for parents of gay children by bringing in a couple that's gay to talk to them. That's seeker-sensitive. That's using whatever means necessary to get people in the door. But in the 1930s and 40s, it was a very good thing because the church is pulling out of the culture, so we need people that are going to push back and say, no, we've got to be in the culture if we're going to reach the culture. And the most prominent person to come out of neo-evangelicalism was Billy Graham. Billy Graham. And so now we get to the boom of the 1950s. And now we're getting close to being in the age that many of you lived through. We're getting into that period you were born in. So a lot of what we're going to be looking at, you lived through. But you had a major moment going on culturally at the time in the 50s. After World War II had ended, you had church attendance booming. It boomed. You had World War II ending, and also 20 years before you'd had the Great Depression. You'd had the Great Depression when money lost its entire value to people. They lost all their possessions. It just became this hopeless thing. So you've had 20 years here of the Great Depression. Well, 30 years technically, World War I, Great Depression, World War II. You've seen a lot of death, a lot of suffering, and a lot of conflict. And so people are thinking about life and meaning. What is it? Why am I here? What does this life mean? So church attendance began to boom. People began to come looking for answers. Now, at the same time as this, in history-wise, in American culture, there was a great fear of Soviet communism. You had the fear of communism, you had the fear of nuclear war. This was known as the Cold War. This is when the Cold War happened. And in this time, Christianity engaging the culture in the 30s and 40s had such influence and that it was really influencing the culture. And what ended up happening in the midst of that, which was good but also had a negative effect, was that being a Christian became very tied to being an American citizen. This is at the time when President Eisenhower added one nation under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. This is when the phrase "in God we trust" became a thing. Those things didn't happen in the 1700s. They happened in the 1950s. So in this time, it became synonymous to be a Christian and to be an American that loves his country. Christians should be good citizens and love their country, but this went a little too far to where people thought, and we still see this today, that because I'm a faithful American that does things right, that's being a Christian. That's not the same thing at all. Those things two are probably going to be together, but it's not the same thing. And so you saw that, which has continued on to our day, which in my opinion makes it a headache to try and share the gospel today. Because people think they're saved because they went to church one time and they love their country. And you've got to teach them how to be lost in order to get them saved for real. But Christianity was seen as both a hope and defense, a hope against all the things that had happened in the last 40 years, but a defense against communism, because communism is very much an atheistic system. And Christianity was a force against that. This is when you had Billy Graham reaching his height. His crusade ministry began in the 40s, but it had its biggest impact in the 50s and beyond. He was different from a lot of fundamentalist preachers of his day. He was polished in what he did. He was very polished. He was media savvy. So he would use media and electronics in ways that preachers before him would have condemned for him to do it. And he was also more friendly toward cultural institutions than being a separatist from them, as the Christians had done right after the Scopes trial. He was willing to be involved in cultural institutions. His influence reached so far that he had the opportunity to advise 12 consecutive U.S. presidents, some of them multiple times. He advised every president from President Truman to President Obama at least once. He did meet Trump, but it was before Trump was president. I think it was 2012 they met. Billy Graham was homebound at the point that Trump became president. But his crusades went worldwide, and he gained prominence as, he came on the scene as America's pastor. That's what they ended up calling him. And he lived until 2018, died at 99 years old. I'm sure you remember when he passed, when his funeral happened. I was in seminary at the time. I remember that. And so, he's on the scene. Christianity's majorly influencing the culture. And so here we are on this chart. We've started at the 20s. We've had the Scopes trial happen, so we've gotten to a low point where Christians are retreating from society. Then we have neo-evangelicalism that wants to push back and engage the culture, which leads to the 50s and the boom in Billy Graham. And now we've got something that's going to happen that's going to take us back down into a dip, and that's the sexual revolution, which was in the 60s. The sexual revolution was a major cultural shift around sex, around marriage, around gender, and around personal freedom. Before this period, American culture generally promoted sex only within marriage, lifelong marriage, traditional family structures, modesty, and there was a major stigma against divorce, against pornography, against homosexuality, and against premarital sex. All of that began to change. During the revolution, those standards changed to where sexual expression was viewed as it should be based on personal freedom and individual fulfillment. That was what sex was being promoted as. So that was the start. Obviously, we can see its effect today, and we see it in the increased acceptance of premarital sex in our day. We see it in rapidly rising divorce rates. We see it in the normalization of cohabitation, two people living together before they're married. We see it in how expansive of an industry pornography is in our day. We see it in the growing acceptance publicly of homosexuality. We see it in changing expectations for women, and later over major legal battles with abortion and LGBTQ issues and all of that. All of this started with the sexual revolution in the 60s. Out of this, as well, came Roe versus Wade, which happened in the 70s, but came from this. When people are having a lot of sex outside of marriage, you get a lot of unwanted pregnancies. And so abortion, it had been around for thousands of years. We see abortion happening in the Roman Empire a long time ago, but it became a legal right by Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court passed it to where abortion was made legal. You could do it legally. And Christians saw this as a weakening of marriage, of family, of sexual ethics, and a general perception of Christian morality was on the decline. So Christians had to figure out how to respond to that. We'll see in a minute how they did that. Also during this time, you had the civil rights issue. You had the issue of African Americans seeking to have full civil rights, which Billy Graham was very involved in, actually, to the criticism of many of his peers at the time. He was very for racial integration when a lot of Christians were against it. He was criticized by that. You had at the time also Martin Luther King Jr. Doing his work. He was a minister, though he was not solid theologically at all. But we can note his major cultural influence. You had at the time mainline denominations declining. We're still seeing that today. The Methodist denomination, the Lutherans, the Episcopals, the Church of Christ, many others, they've been on the decline since the 60s. I read an article a few years ago that that they're concerned the Episcopal Church won't last 10 to 15 more years in Canada, because it's just so being fled from by people. People are not attending them anymore. Not all of them, but some declined because of liberal theology. Because when a church adopts liberal theology, all the people that truly believe the gospel and hold to Orthodox Christianity leave. And so all that's left are the liberals who don't believe the gospel, and ultimately, in the long run, don't have a ton of reason to be connected to this, and it slowly declines. Finally, you had the rise of the Jesus movement in this time. The Jesus movement, if you want, there's a movie that came out in 2023 called The Jesus Revolution. It's a movie that documented the Jesus movement, and this was a time when hippies were prevalent, and Christians. The Jesus movement was Christians that reached out to hippies, and hippies that got really excited for Christ. Hippies had rejected traditional Christianity, but still sought out meaning. And so a major revival happened when Christians began to engage them. But for many, it was unorthodox, because you had nice church people dressed in their Sunday best that were very uncomfortable with these long-haired hippies and their tie-dye shirts coming into church. And that's what was happening. But we saw major movement in the gospel in that. Many influences remain from the Jesus movement today. One being Christian contemporary music. That's when this started, was with the Jesus movement. They started making music that was not as tied to tradition, but was in a different context that could reach people in that way. From the Jesus movement, you got casual church culture, so it began to be less and less of a really nice thing that you dress up for. You got from that youth-focused ministry, where the big focus in church is on reaching the next generation. And then you just got the non-traditional types of church buildings. So maybe a church that meets in a coffee house style kind of thing. A lot of that came from the Jesus movement, and it's been reaching a lot of different types of people in that way. So you continue down the chart here. I'm going to keep referring back to this chart. But the sexual revolution led to a change in cultural morals. So how would Christians respond? Well, we go to the back now with the formation of the moral majority. In response to the revolution, Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority. This is in the 70s and 80s now. In the 70s and 80s, it became an influential force. The Moral Majority did. It became an influential force for mobilizing conservative evangelicals into national politics, which up to this point, remember, because of the things that happened in the 20s, Christians had in a lot of ways pulled themselves out of politics and out of those types of things. And so many evangelicals believed America was in moral decline because of a number of factors, the sexual revolution and drugs and abortion and secularism. And so up until now, many fundamentalists had avoided direct political involvement, believing politics was worldly and corrupt. But the Moral Majority was going to organize Christians to vote on issues such as abortion and family and school prayer and anti-communism and all of those things. The Moral Majority worked closely with President Reagan. Reagan wasn't really known as a devoted evangelical, but Christians saw him as an ally against secular liberalism. Positive and negative things came from the Moral Majority. First of all, positively, it moved Christians to action. Christians had adopted this idea of being separate and not being involved in the affairs of the world. God used the moral majority to snap them out of it and move them to action. The negative thing that came from it is that it got a good majority of Christians, even still today, to abdicate their responsibility in the Great Commission to just being the politician's job. To think that our only Christian duty and the only way we win the world for Christ is just to vote the right people into office. Caveat, I'm very for Christians playing their part in the political process. But note, that's not what Jesus or the apostles did. Jesus and the apostles preached the gospel, made disciples no matter what the political systems of the world did to them. And many Christians coming out of the moral majority left it up to politicians to Christianize the world, and that abandons our calling in the Great Commission. Let me give you an example of this in the issue of school prayer. It's true that in 1962, the Supreme Court outlawed school-sponsored prayer. What that means is a teacher cannot lead his or her class in prayer at the beginning of class. What that does not mean was that people could not pray in school. I got students together, even faculty, when I was a student, to pray regularly. I did that myself. The question is not, is the government going to allow teachers to lead prayer in school? The government has never been able to stop the church. The question is, are faithful believers in Christ going to be faithful to him even when laws don't allow them to be? And so that's kind of the positive and the negative of the moral majority. But the moral majority began to swing the pendulum back the other way from the influence of the sexual revolution. But then the downward slope came. So you look back at your chart. We're kind of in the middle of the graph. The moral majority led to the Reagan era, to Christians being an influence in politics. Very high point here, and then you lead into a downward slope. Televangelism. It's how the moral majority gains support. They gain support through televangelism. People on TV preaching and raising money. And I just say I commend the church for using new methods, the television and broadcasting, to get the gospel out. We've got to always be doing that. That's why we just hired an intern to handle reaching people online on social media, because we got to be doing that. That's how we get the gospel out. But today, what do we primarily think of when we think of televangelist? Getting rich, okay. Money, corruption, yeah. What else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We think of financial corruption. We think of hypocrisy, and often we think of false teaching as well. Kind of those three things define a lot of televangelists. So you had people that started out with Jim and Tammy Baker. You had Jimmy Swaggart. You had Pat Robertson, and then you got into the ones that are still around today: Kenneth Copeland, T.D. Jakes, Benny Hinn, Joel Osteen. Nearly every televangelist had some kind of fall, had some kind of either moral failure or financial embezzlement or false doctrine about them, unfortunately. But that was the influence of Christianity for a while. In the ways that, in a lot of ways, YouTube and TikTok are being used to do today, where people are using those platforms to promote the gospel and to get the gospel out, even though often it turns into a nasty fight every day that I see on social media. And so we start down, the televangelism comes down to a period of corruption, moral failure with the televangelist, which becomes a repudiation for the gospel in a lot of ways. But out of that, we see the rise of the megachurch era. Alongside televangelists, you had this rise. A megachurch, understand, is typically defined as a church that has a weekly attendance of 2,000 or more people. That's what a megachurch is. So I guess if you have 1,500, you're not a megachurch. You probably feel like one. You're not a megachurch. 2,000 or more. Technically, the first megachurch was Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, pastored by Charles Spurgeon in the 1800s. But the modern form of megachurches emerged in the 70s and 80s. Which might surprise you, because we typically associate megachurches with teenagers and people in their 20s. But megachurches are in many ways a baby boomer phenomenon. People born between 1946 and 1964. Megachurches were started by that group. All signs are pointing to megachurches being on decline today. and that young people of today are wanting smaller communities for a church. Maybe a church like 200 to 400 people. It's just where they can know each other, where they can have relationship, where they can be in each other's lives in that way. Mega churches were well led. Two men led the way in the mega church phenomenon. First is Rick Warren. Second is Bill Hybels. Warren was pastor of Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, California. You probably know him. You may not know Bill Hybels as well. Bill Hybels was pastor of Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. And unfortunately, both of them have had some kind of fall. Rick Warren just has drifted into a lot of false theology, especially around the issue of women pastors. I think he's a believer, but he's gone a lot really wrong way on a lot of theological issues. Hybels got really into sexual misconduct. You can read reports about that. But some mega churches are very good, and many have had great influence for good. But the mega church phenomenon produced two major problems. First is a shift in theology. A shift in theology. It really changed the understanding of what is a church. What is a church? Excuse me. The Greek word for church in the New Testament is ekklesia. And ekklesia, the word just means gathering or assembly. The word ekklesia is used in some Greek writings to not refer to a church, just it's a gathering of people that happened. A church is an ekklesia, a gathering or assembly. So a church is an assembly at the most basic level. So if you have a church that has 8 campuses all over a big city that all call themselves the same church, you got whatever church, you got the South Campus, you got the North Campus, you got the Southeast Campus, and all of that. They're all calling themselves the same church, but they're 8 different locations. What do you have there? You have 8 churches right there. That's what you have. You don't have one church. You've got 8 churches that maybe all are organized around the same group of people, but it's 8 different gatherings if we're talking about a church. If you have a church where in one part of the building there's a traditional service and in another part of the building there's a contemporary service, what do you have? You have 2 churches there. They may meet in the same building, but they're 2 different gatherings in different locations. If you have a church that has an 8:30 a.m. service and 11 a.m. worship service, what do you have? You have 2 churches there. They meet at different times in the same building. I understand multiple services are sometimes necessary when you outgrow your building, but we should do whatever we can to not have that, to have all the church together at one time. So if you view church as a business organization, you will do things like this. You will have an expanding number of campuses all around the city that all call themselves the same church. What they should do in that scenario, just plant churches throughout the city and send people out to pastor them and to lead them. But it's no different than Chick-fil-A or Target when it's something like this. It's one CEO, one group of people that lead it, and all kinds of different stores around the city or around the state. This is what church became. And if you view it as a gathering of believers to each covenant that are covenanted to each other in membership, you can't split it up without it being 2 different groups in that way. So a shift in theology. Secondly, a shift in practice. Shift in practice. They began to use church growth methods, which are what we would label them as. And a lot of them were not all wrong, but they weren't the best either. And often they were methods that were a lot more like secular business principles than biblical wisdom. And the great problem with any of these methods is this principle. What you win people to church with is what you got to keep them with. So if you have a summer sermon series where you're going to do summer at the movies, and you're going to show a 15-minute clip of a movie and then preach some kind of biblical principle from that clip, if that's what you're going to get people in church with, we're going to be in church to watch movies and then hear a little talk about them. As soon as you stop doing that, they're gone. They're gone. What you win people with is what you keep them with. Let me just give you an example. Are there any restaurants that you used to love and they changed the recipe and you no longer eat there? Any restaurants like that? For me, it's Domino's Pizza. They changed the recipe about, 15 years ago. Haven't liked it since. I'll eat it if it's at a party or something, but it's by far my least favorite pizza. Because they changed the recipe. What they had kept me with in the first place, they've lost me because they changed it. So they would win people with superficial methods, and then they would easily lose them when they did this. Also, if you're a church of over 2,000 people, you probably have tens of thousands of members, many that don't show up, and it's just really hard to keep up with that many people. It's just really hard to properly shepherd them, properly care for them. People easily fall through the cracks. And out of the megachurch phenomenon, you had which led to Christian celebrity culture, which is your final line there under the 70s and the 80s, which was just an extension of the megachurch phenomenon, because when you have a guy that's preaching to 10,000 people every Sunday, he gains celebrity status eventually. When this happens, pastors and preachers become celebrities, and I don't really think that's what Christ intended for most of his pastors. But it's what a lot of pastors want to pursue. I want to have the biggest crowd as I possibly can. Certainly, there have been influential preachers that are going to have a following, from the Apostle Paul to Billy Graham, but most preachers don't need celebrity status. They just need to faithfully love the people they're in charge, that they're entrusted to, and stick to that. When a preacher gets celebrity status, it gets dangerous. 1 Corinthians 4:13, we have become, Paul says this, we have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. Christian celebrities became a terrible thing because the higher up someone is, the harder they fall and the farther they fall. I forget who the guy was, from Hillsong Church, which is a church in Australia that has a really big worship ministry, a lot of music that's really great. But one of the leaders of the church, I can't remember his name, but I watched a documentary about him a couple years ago where he got really famous to the point that he was like hanging out with Justin Bieber and hanging out with all kinds of celebrities, and he was buying $1,000 pairs of pants. And I mean, it just went really bad, and eventually he crumbled and fell, and he's worked his way back and healed from it. But when you're not in that kind of position, you don't have that kind of temptation, and that's what happened. We've seen countless Christian celebrities fail morally, usually around sex or money. That's usually what gets people, sex or money. And what that does is that repudiates the gospel in people's eyes. This is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:27, I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. That's the high calling of a Christian and of a pastor, and the higher up you get in celebrity status, the more things you got to manage, and the harder it is to discipline your body and keep it under control. So, look back on your chart. The megachurch era had a lot of good things, certainly had some negative things, but it started to work our way up to a high point, which then came a crucial nation-shattering moment, and you know what it is. The nation was shaken by 9/11. 9/11, just like World War II, led to a lot of people searching after it was over. 9/11 happened. They were looking for meaning and hope, because in this moment they were shown their own mortality. This could easily happen to any of us. I wasn't a Christian when 9/11 happened, and I wasn't in church, so I can't answer this question. Does anyone remember what church was like the Sunday after 9/11? The Sunday after 9/11, it was full? Yeah, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But what was that?
It was also very emotional.
Was it? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get to that in just a second. So John MacArthur, pastor in California, died recently. He had a Sunday night. He changed his Sunday night service the Sunday after 9/11 and just spent time preaching and answering questions. And I think it went on till like midnight because people were so hungry for answers. So that's what happened right at the peak of 9/11. And you had in this time as well, politicians began to use religious language a lot. Unfortunately, as Jerry just said, it did not last long. Studies have found that the revival after 9/11 only lasted a few weeks or maybe a few months, and then it was over. Excuse me. So you had then the 2000s consisting with a war with Islam because of what happened at 9/11. Just like with the battle against communism back in the 50s that we talked about, there was this identity that came with being an American and being a Christian, where Islam was our enemy, but unfortunately often it was because they were our enemy because of 9/11, not because they rejected Jesus as Lord. Both of those are bad, but we would disconnect the two. Because this was so tied together, it didn't help that the war with Iraq was pretty negatively viewed the further you got from 9/11. I don't know if you remember that or not. I always really respected George W. Bush as president for the first 3 or 4 years of his presidency, and I saw public opinion turn more and more and more on him because of the war in Iraq. There was something happening in American society in this time, shift happening in society. A man named Aaron Renn wrote a book in 2024 called Life in the Negative World. And he said that there are 3 phases of Christian status in America since the 1960s. You have first the positive world. There on your sheet, the positive world. That's 1964 to 1994. I don't remember what the event is that he says divides this. It might be something to do with Bill Clinton. I can't remember. But 1994 is when the positive world ended. The positive world was that Christians were viewed favorably during this time, and going to church enhanced your reputation, and public morality was largely Christian, and violating those norms was shameful. 1994 to 2014 was the neutral world. The neutral world. This is where there was a tolerance for Christians, but not an embrace. Faith was viewed as a personal thing, like a hobby. It didn't help you or hurt you in the public square. It was something you did personally. And Christianity was viewed as one of many options in a diverse society. I don't remember again what happened in 2014 to make the shift. I know that's a year before the Obergefell decision happened with same-sex marriage, but I don't. That wouldn't be in 2014, so I'm not sure. But the third one would be the negative world, which is 2014 to the present, where the culture is primarily hostile toward Christianity. Being a Christian is a social and career liability now, and our views are viewed as harmful and a threat to public good. So Aaron Renn, who wrote this book breaking down this, he argues that if the world has changed that much, then our strategy for reaching them has to change. What worked in the 1970s to reach somebody is not going to work in 2026. We're going to have to shift our methods of reaching people. The gospel stays the same, doctrines stay the same, our practice stays the same, but we're probably going to engage people differently than we did 50 years ago. All in all, the country was in a much different place between 9/11 and the election of Obama. 8 years, very different place regarding Christianity in America. So we get to our sheet. You can look back at your sheet. Revival of 9/11 was the high point. The Bush and Obama era brought us down to the low point. And in this time, you saw many things happen. 2008 to 2020, we saw a downward slope in Christianity with many things happening. You see them all listed there. First was the rise of the nuns. Not the nuns like the Catholic ladies, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. A nun, in this regard, is a person that has no religious affiliation. They're not Christian, they're not atheist, they're not religious. They just don't have any thoughts about religion whatsoever. There's been so much fighting over it that they've seen, they just don't give any time to it. Next is Christian deconstruction. Christian deconstruction. This became a process, especially in the 2010s, of where someone would critically examine and dismantle and reevaluate the faith they had held. And so it'd be something like they took an old clock and took it apart and looked at all the parts and put it back together. And maybe they didn't put it back together the same way. It was kind of like remodeling a house. The Christian deconstruction was usually triggered by something. It might be what's called church hurt. They were involved in a church and someone or the church as a whole really hurt them and they just kind of had to pull away. It might be culture. They were unable to reconcile traditional church views with the cultural issues of our day, so they had to figure out a way to be Christian and be relevant in the culture. Might be theology. They started thinking about things like the doctrine of hell, or that how can a good God allow suffering or something like that, and they had to take apart their faith and put it back together, and they're not really sure what they came back to. Maybe they're just burned out. Maybe a pastor who has given all he can to the church, so as a defense mechanism, he just questions his entire worldview. It would often result in people, leaving the faith altogether. Or turning to the next thing on the list, progressive Christianity. Progressive Christianity is just today's version of liberal theology. It's Christianity that is all about conforming our faith to modern worldview around race and gender and sexual orientation. It ends up not being Christianity at all. It just ends up being some kind of like amalgamation that features Jesus but talks more like today than anything else. Then you had the Obergefell decision, which happened in this time. It was in 2015. I was actually in El Salvador when this was passed. We got a little Wi-Fi and we turned on our phone and we saw it and we were like, oh my goodness, that happened while we were gone. It was the legalization of same-sex marriage. And that would now change a lot of what Christians had to think and do in the world. So you had to have issues now of, what does a pastor do if a same-sex couple ask him to officiate their wedding and he says no and they sue him for it? You've got issues to think about now like that you didn't have before 2015. And then finally, you have in this time Trump and Christian nationalism. All of these things that had happened, Rise of the Nuns, Deconstruction, Progressive, Obergefell, they were a gumbo together that made a right place for someone like Donald Trump to emerge. Maybe the most controversial guy in the last 100 years, right? Many conservative Christians didn't know what to do. How do you fix all of this? How do you fix all this stuff that's happened since 2008? You've got Islam in the 2000s. You've got all the corruption of the 70s and 80s. You've got the sexual revolution. You've got evolution. All these things we've looked at tonight. How do you fix all this? Well, the answer is there's no silver bullet or magic button to fix stuff like that. It takes years and years of faithfulness. I hope we've seen that as we've looked over 2,000 years of church history. Nothing in church history changed by just flipping a switch. If the state of things today has been headed here since the 1800s, you're not going to fix it flipping a switch or even 4 to 8 years of a president. But Trump came on the scene, and it looked as though he could fix it in 4 years or less. He would make America great again. And many conservative Christians, in many conservatives and Christians' eyes, the country had been on the decline since the 60s, even though we've seen it was actually more of an ebb and flow on your chart. And so Trump came on the scene and was able to make his movement from that. Now, nothing I'm saying right now is regarding how Trump has done as a president. I know you start commenting on that, you're in dangerous water. But I think he's done some good things as president. I think he's really said some dumb things. So we'll leave it at that. But what I want to comment on is how Christians have so latched onto Trump as a savior. They've latched onto him as a savior. You know this is the case, don't you? Christians condemned Bill Clinton for his Monica Lewinsky incident, but they give Trump a pass for anything bad he does. They will watch him say some of the most cruel and arrogant statements, and they'll give him a pass. We need someone bold in Washington. And it's been a headache and a heartbreak for me for the past 10 years to watch Christians treat Trump like he's the Messiah and Jesus is one of his prophets. We honor him as president, absolutely. We pray for him as president. But we know a lot of Christians have gone way beyond honor in the past 10 years. This attachment has led to what's called Christian nationalism. What is that? Well, a couple weeks ago, they had the Rededicate 250 thing up in D.C., the big worship rally on the national lawn. Very good thing. But Robert Jeffress was preaching at it. I just saw a clip of it online. Robert Jeffress is the pastor of First Baptist Dallas. And I just saw a clip of him saying, if being a Christian nationalist means I love Jesus and love America, sign me up. That's not what Christian nationalism is. It's just not. We know that. We should not align ourselves so flippantly with Christian nationalism. Essentially, what is Christian nationalism? Well, it's the view that Christianity needs to take over everything in society. Since America is a Christian nation, we have to remove all non-Christians from power and completely change all laws to reflect Christian moral principles, even if we have to use force to do that. That's how a lot of people think today. It's often tied to a view of the end times called postmillennialism, where they believe the millennium in Revelation 20 is a golden age that we will live in before Jesus returns. He doesn't return before the millennium, he returns after the millennium. And so the gospel and the Great Commission do its job and make the world Christian. And so Jesus returns to a golden age. They'll tie it to that. But it's not what we do biblically. We must remember three things. First of all, laws don't change hearts. We want good laws in place, absolutely. Laws that they stop evil from prevailing, but they don't change hearts. If you think laws are going to make every non-believer submit to Jesus, you're just mistaken. Secondly, that's not how Jesus said his kingdom would come. Matthew 13, actually one parable that I didn't preach in my parable series, but I think I commented on it at one point. Matthew 13, 31 through 34, Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it's larger than all the garden plants. It becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make their nest in its branches." So Jesus doesn't make this picture that his kingdom grows by, just this big, massive explosion all at once. He says that it's a seed, you put it in the ground, it slowly grows, and it slowly builds into this beautiful thing. But thirdly, Christian nationalism is not the Great Commission. Jesus said, go preach the gospel, see people saved, and the world will be transformed by that. He did not say go in with a battering ram and mow over all the non-believers and set up a Christian society. That's not the Great Commission. I promise you the Roman Empire was way worse than America has ever been, and that's not what Jesus and the apostles did. That's what they expected Jesus to do, but that's not what he did. So all of this, as you'll see in your map, it brought Christianity to a low point in our country. The Bush-Obama era led to all these things. This was the low point. But then something happened that I think turned the tide. We won't know for several years, but I think it turned the tide. It was COVID-19. That was the great turning point of our time, COVID-19. Do you remember that time? I sometimes have nightmares about it. What? Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Uh-huh. Right. Right.
I think he was saying the founder, our nation was found under God,
Sure.
and that he was saying that people have denigrated our country, they prosecuted us Christians, and so I'm going to be up here, I'm praying, and maybe I feel like he has a different definition of that. So I think for people that, that might get criticized for supporting Trump,
Uh-huh.
what alternative do they have? What alternative is there until he's taken of office?
Uh-huh.
Puerto Rico down in Texas,
Yeah.
who says that God's not
Yeah. He's very dangerous. Yeah.
yes. So, people are scared.
Yeah. No, and I agree that it's a messy situation. I just look at all of church history, and the answer was never put our hope in the state. It was always put our hope in Christ.
We have to live with it.
We do.
We want our religious freedom.
Yeah.
It's going to be somebody from the government will help us in America as
Mm-hmm.
And if we're persecuted as Christians, I mean, we might can still do it, but not to the extent that you could if we had freedom of religion. But our freedom of religion in America is threatened,
Yeah.
highly threatened.
So I think religious freedom is a bedrock of a free society. But also, let's recognize that there's countries all around the world that don't have it, and the gospel's spreading there like crazy. So the spread of the gospel is not hindered if religious freedom isn't here, because the Holy Spirit is the one doing it. And so,
I still believe that, I mean, personally, I want my children and my grandchildren to be in a free country.
yeah, I do too.
And not,
Right.
and Trump's not, I can't stand a lot of the stuff he says. If I could have any influence on that, I would do it.
Yeah.
But not now.
Right.
But the alternative is so much worse.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's two not good situations. You got to choose the lesser. Yeah.
We see it. They've already got Europe, and they're coming here.
Yeah. Right.
They're already here.
Right.
New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people say, why Christians support Trump like he is.
Uh-huh.
She said, we have no alternative. You look at the policies of what they believe in, and which way they will lead,
Uh-huh.
you make the choice on that.
Yeah.
He was better choice of the two evils.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately. Yeah. Right. So we get to COVID, COVID-19, and in COVID-19, obviously we had to halt church for several weeks. I believe for us, we were out on March 8th through June 14th, if I remember correctly. We ended, I was in Arizona March 8th, and I know we didn't have church that day, and I think June 14th is when we started back. It had major effects on churches, first being attendance. Obviously, we were told 20% of our church wouldn't come back after COVID. That happened in some churches, didn't happen in others. But secondly, was a wake-up call, for others, and they got connected with church. Some people, obviously, just like with World War II, just like with 9/11, your mortality is put before you, so you got to start thinking about things that are spiritual. They were confronted with the fact that they might die almost every day. They might breathe in the wrong air particle and die from it. It allowed churches to examine what was necessary, and what was necessary, and what were they just holding on to for tradition's sake. It allowed churches to easily change things they needed to. If there was a program that needed to be altered or changed or even done away with so something else could come in, that was pretty easy to do when you're not meeting and you're about to have to change everything about your church. A negative aspect of this, the effects on churches, was it led to Christian conspiracy theories, which are all over the place now. The big prominent one during that time was the COVID vaccine has a microchip in it, and that's the mark of the beast. I don't know. I don't think Revelation implies that you're going to accidentally take the mark of the beast in a vaccine. But anyway, so that was COVID, and now as you see on the thing on the back, it's headed up. I think this is hard to tell right now, but I think in a few years we might be able to look back and see. Right now, as far as Christian influence, I think we're moving more toward a high point. You've seen it in the last few years with Generation Z, the great hope of Generation Z, those born 1997 to 2012. They are very hungry and getting very serious about Christ. Not all of them. It's not a general rule, but we are seeing a lot of it. In the ABAC BCM, it's been growing for several years now. More and more students coming to attend it. Multiple guys in the past few years have surrendered to ministry out of it. I think a major revealing point was when Charlie Kirk died, which happened last year. I don't really like all that his organization has become since he died. I grind my teeth when they put Kid Rock up as a Christian icon at the Super Bowl. When I went and looked at his Twitter account from the week before, and he was posting jokes about male body parts, we'll just put it that way. But he was put forth as this Christian hero. I didn't really like all of Charlie Kirk's rhetoric. At times he would, when he was debating students on campus, he wouldn't listen to them. He would talk over them and silence them to get his point across. But he was a follower of Christ, and his influence has greatly impacted, especially guys in their 20s. It's just really had an influence. And it's something like what Jesus says, where a seed falls in the earth and dies, and a lot grows from it. I think that's what's happened. And all signs indicate we're on an upward trajectory in a lot of ways. Opposition may continue to arise, but the church is being faithful in the face of it. Churches are being planted. The gospel is being preached. Georgia Baptist just reported that baptisms are up right now, which is a really good sign. They've been down for years and years and years, and all of a sudden they're up. So we must resist the temptation to be a cynic. The future is not as bleak as you think it is. God is actively doing some really great things, and he's going to continue to do that because nothing can stop him. One of the great battles for Baptists today, as I said this morning at the conclusion, is the issue of female pastors. SBC next week. It's been an issue on the floor for years now about whether or not a Southern Baptist church can have a female pastor. If the Baptist Faith and Message, our doctrinal statement defines that the pastor's office can only be held by men, but there's been major debate on, does a church that's part of the SBC have to hold 100% to the Baptist Faith and Message? And so this year, my seminary president, Dr. Moeller, is proposing an amendment to the SBC Constitution that forbids a church from being in the SBC who has a female pastor. And it's been a nasty situation in the past 2 weeks since he announced that on social media, because people are twisting what he says to say that he's saying women can't do any ministry at all and that they can't share the gospel. That they're saying that's what Dr. Moeller's saying. That's not what he's saying at all. There is an office in the church, elder, pastor, bishop, and Scripture's clear that's reserved for men. It's their role. Anything else women can do. Like, they're allowed to share the gospel, they're allowed to minister, they're allowed to do all those things. But when you muddy the waters about what a pastor can be, every denomination that has gone liberal, that's the first issue they compromised on. Every one of them. They start with having a female pastor, and pretty soon they're, every minister's wearing a rainbow flag on their vestige, and it just goes into madness. So that's a major issue with Baptists today. You can pray for that. But in your final column there, the hub of Christianity is shifting from North America. We see that just demographically. In the future, it's much more likely the most Christian areas in the world will be South America and Africa. We're just seeing that in how the gospel is spreading in those places and how it's kind of plateaued here for the past several years. That doesn't mean North America won't be Christian, but there's a lot of things happening in South America and Africa that's making Christianity dominant there. We're seeing the greatest number of conversions in those places. The Great Commission will be fulfilled. We've talked a lot about the Great Commission over the course of our time because that's the job Jesus left the church to do. That's the big thing we're supposed to be doing. It's our marching orders. Go make disciples of all the nations. Baptize them, teach them. I'm with you always forever. We're called to go do that. And we know the Great Commission will be fulfilled because in the book of Revelation, chapter 7, we see this scene around the throne. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." It says there that every tribe and people and language and nation is around the throne of God. That means the Great Commission is going to be successful. It's going to reach all nations. We're going to see all nations reached with the gospel. And so until Jesus comes, we remain faithful. We continue to be faithful. He may return next week. He may not return for 1,000 years. I don't like it when I hear a person say, I believe he's coming very soon, because you don't really know. He said he's coming soon, but he said that 2,000 years ago. So clearly soon for him means something else than what we imagine it to mean. I don't know what that means, but he's coming at some point. I'm waiting for him. We don't know when. Until he comes, we continue to do what he's called the church to do through all generations that we've studied for the past 12 sessions. We continue the faithful work of Polycarp, of Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Edwards, Whitefield, B.B. Warfield, Billy Graham, and all the others. We preach the gospel, we make disciples, we lift up Christ, we live holy lives, and we stay faithful, and we trust the promise of Jesus. Matthew 16:18. I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The greatest force in all, the greatest evil force in existence will not prevail against the church. It hasn't for 2,000 years, and it never will. He has done this through so many challenges we've looked at in history, so many doctrinal battles, so many persecutions, so many high and low points, and he's going to continue to do it till the end. So any questions before we sing our final hymn? All right, well, tonight we sing In Christ Alone, which is my favorite hymn. I've told Adrian I want it sung at my